right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of the Technically Brilliant show presented by the Den Black Film Festival and Black Public Media. My name is Ebony Johnson. I serve as the Director of Education and Outreach for Den Black Film Festival. And we're happy to have you join our lunch session this afternoon as we connect with Black artists, filmmakers, execs who are using virtual reality and augmented reality and other technologies to tell Black stories. We've had a great past couple of weeks. We've had artist Carla Lindell Bishop. Our first week, Alton Glass, was last week talking about their inspiring works. And if you've missed any of our shows thus far, I will link them within the comments. You can check them out on Den Black Film Festival's YouTube and Facebook page, also Black Public Media's Instagram and Vimeo channel. Before I bring up our lovely moderator, I have one housekeeping rule for everyone watching, and that is to please interact with us and engage with us. Our guests are here for your benefit as well, so please ask any questions, just type them into the comment section, and we'll cover them during the broadcast. So guiding our conversation today is Black Public Media's Director of Emerging Media, Miss Lisa Osborne. Let me bring Lisa onto the stream.
Hi, Ebony.
Hello. We are back at it. Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. And I've seen a lot of coverage about, Black Wall Street with the centennial of the massacre. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with Bayete, which I will bring on, and I'll bow out gracefully.
Okay. As Ebony was saying, we've seen a lot of coverage about the 100th year anniversary of the Black Wall Street Massacre this week. And, there's been congressional hearings that included 4 survivors, which is unbelievable. Plus, I've seen notable coverage from NPR, and the New York Times earlier this week released a quite comprehensive interactive piece, an online piece, that details which businesses were destroyed and what the businesses used to offer and who they belong to, which really is such a tangible and necessary piece of record keeping on behalf of the country, so that it really brings history to life instead of just hearing statistics about the number of people who were harmed. That it really brings to life that this was a store owned by the Burtons or owned by the Rosses. For many Americans, hearing about the Tulsa massacre this week was the first time that they'd ever heard about the attack. It's not a standard part of most American history textbooks here in the United States or our social studies textbooks. One of the reasons that I supported Bayeté's project was that it was the first VR project or film project I'd heard about that looked at so-called race riots as a group of events instead of as one-off isolated incidents. Whenever something takes place over and over, there are bound to be patterns. Why were racially motivated attacks allowed to take place multiple times across the US with absolutely no repercussions for the attackers? Instead of laying the blame on unrelated individuals, Bayeté's thesis is that there are certain systems help to enforce, sustain, and protect the perpetrators and their white supremacist beliefs. In Red Summer's VR, Bayeté is focusing on America's legal system specifically as the main culprit for the lack of accountability for these attacks. I had never seen a film project approach the topic of so-called race riots with this particular lens. So I brought Black Public Media on board as a production partner for the project. Let's bring on Bayeté.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a great introduction.
Thank you. I'm completely serious. I had never seen any project, at least a filmed project. I'd heard of books about, race massacres in the US, but I had never seen a film project approach looking at them as a group or an aggregate. And I thought that was really a fresh take as well as the fact that you decided to focus on the legal aspect of these attacks specifically. When did you first learn about Tulsa? Do you even remember?
I first learned about Tulsa fairly early in life, meaning I learned about it in my 20s. And that was because I went to a historically Black college. For one. And so someone mentioned it there, and then I learned about that. And then I learned about a few of the other incidents from the Red Summer of 1919. But it wasn't until I was in my mid to late 30s that I realized that, what's called the Chicago 1919 race riot and the Washington, D.C. 1919 race riot and Elaine, Arkansas 1919 were all part of this larger pattern of behavior that year called the Red Summer.
So basically, from age 7 to 17, when you were from primary school all the way up through the end of high school, you had never been exposed to any history lessons about the race riots in the U.S. before you reach college. Is that fair?
I'm trying to think about that. I did not. Well, so here's the thing that's interesting about that. I did, but it was things that happened in the 60s.
I see.
And then, I was in high school when 1992 happened in LA and Rodney King.
Right.
And that's a really interesting and compelling thing about one of my motivations for this series. And, Cameron McWhirter, one of the historians I interviewed for this series, mentioned this as well. When people think of a race riot, if you were to ask someone out on the street, just walking down the street about a race riot, they might be like, oh, are you talking about Detroit in the 60s or DC in the 60s? Or, they might mention LA in 1992. But the reality is the vast, vast majority of these mass violent events that have happened in American history have been white mobs attacking Black people and Black property. And that's not how they're contextualized at all in our popular understanding.
I find the term race riot to be incredibly misleading because it sounds like people of color, or specifically Black people, became angry about something and decided to protest in a very spontaneous and, unplanned and disorganized way. And sort of that the whole purpose of the riot was to destroy property. But that is not actually what a typical race riot comprised. When you and I talked, you're like, race riots were primarily racially motivated attacks on Black communities that have been happening for the entire history of the country, but that there was an especially sort of an explosion of them about a century ago in the United States. And so we discussed the language how even using the term race riot was, prejudicial and also just incorrect from a factual perspective. And so what is the term that you decided to use instead of race riot when you're talking about this project?
Yeah, so these are acts of domestic terrorism. And the reason they're domestic terrorism is because they were specifically and intentionally done and designed, so to speak, to inspire terror in Black communities and other communities of color, but primarily Black communities. And these are things that followed a similar pattern throughout U.S. history. So there's a model for them. And so you can tell that these models are intentionally repeated. And due to the lack of legal accountability, there's significant reason to realize that that's part of why people thought they could continue to act in this way and continue to participate in this type of behavior.
Do you think how many, I have like 3 questions at once. When you started to research this topic to see if you really wanted to do some sort of either art project or film project about it, how long did you spend researching the topic and how many attacks did you come across?
Well, initially I did, several months of research before I realized, like, okay, this is a concept that really has legs. And it started off with Chicago 1919.
Okay.
Because
Why that one? Like, why did that one get your attention, or how did it even get on your radar?
Yeah, sorry. That one is fairly well known and discussed amongst Black Chicagoans, although a lot of white Chicagoans don't know that much about it.
I went to school there for 4 years and lived there for another year after that, and I had no awareness that there was any type of domestic terrorism attack on Black citizens of Chicago, 75 years before I lived there.
Yeah. So, my guess is that a lot of these events end up living in local lore and in the local and personal archives of individuals and groups within the communities, families and groups within the communities. But so, because I knew a lot of people from Chicago, I had heard about that one, and that sparked my interest. And then once I started digging, I started reading about these other race riots that same year. And then I started looking at what was happening in other years. And I was like, oh, there's a lot of these that happened.
Right.
And again, very similar.
Can you give us any, in the 5-year period that your films are focused on, how do you have any sense for from 1917 to 21?
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for typically like how many took place in that 5-year period across the country? Do you even know?
Well, in the Red Summer of 1919 alone, there's about 30. And then, there's several in 1917, most notably the East St. Louis. And then there's also Houston of 1917, which led to what I still believe is the largest court martial in U.S. history. That incident basically stemmed from a battle between Black soldiers and a local police department in Houston that was abusing the Black community in that area, and soldiers were attempting to defend them. You have to remember at this point in time, again, race riots were common. These acts of domestic terrorism that were referred to as race riots were common, and then just lynchings were common too. And a lot of, what we would now call white supremacist groups like the White League and the KKK very much had infiltrated law enforcement and a lot of people in official capacities. So it would make sense that, Black soldiers who were preparing to fight in World War I would feel the need to protect the Black community. But there's several in 1917. I haven't read about any specifically in 1918. But I know they happened. It's just how high profile are they? So it's really a matter of how much digging do you do and how high profile are the different incidents.
Right. Were there certain cultural triggers or event triggers or economic triggers that prompted 30 in 1 year seems extraordinary. So when you said that there were 30 in 1917, do you have any sense for was there like legislation passed that gave Black people more, agency in society that then had this sort of backlash approach? Or do you have any sense for what were the contextual causes, perhaps?
Yeah, so 1917 was particularly violent because you have the end of World War I.
Okay.
You have the Great Migration, which is African Americans moving from the South to the Northeast and Midwest and West Coast. And let me just say, like, these happened all over the country. This is not just the South.
Right.
This is the Northeast. This is the Midwest. This is the West Coast. This is the Southwest. It's all over the country.
Okay.
So you have the Great Migration. So Black people are migrating to other areas of the country. You have Black soldiers returning from World War I as veterans. And while Black soldiers weren't awarded medals by the U.S. government for their courage and bravery, they were awarded medals by the French government. And so,
that's interesting.
Yeah, they received the Croix de Guerre, if I'm pronouncing it right, from France. And so Black soldiers are coming back saying, okay, we fought in this war of freedom to make the world safe for democracy. We're not going to be treated like second-class citizens anymore. There's a feeling that World War I was a test Black people had passed it, and now it was time to be treated as citizens. And all that was seen as threatening to a lot of white populations, because a lot of white people at that time still did not want to treat Black people as true Americans. A lot of them were interested in like the idea of legal equality, similar to now, but in actual practice, in actual social situations, and therefore social justice, they didn't want to do that.
Got it. Got it. Why did you decide how many, well, first of all, how many of the attacks between 1917 and 1921 is your project covering?
My project covers 7 of them. So
okay, can you name them for us? Which
yes.
city?
So it covers East St. Louis in 1917 and Houston, Texas in 1917. It obviously covers Tulsa in 1921, and then it covers Elaine, Arkansas from 1919, Chicago, Illinois from 1919, Washington, D.C. in 1919, and Omaha, Nebraska in 1919. And I covered these ones because I thought they all told different portions of the story that created a full picture of these acts as domestic terrorism and as part of a continuum.
Right. Okay. Were you like, are you into the law? Are you a legal scholar? I notice your other project, Our Kind of People, also has a, sort of legal underpinning to that project. Is that, it seems like that's something that you're drawn to. Has that always been the case, or has this been sort of recently in the last 3 to 5 years?
So I'm not really a legal scholar, but I've always been interested in policy and the process for policy creation. And a few years ago, it really hit me that people with legal education are often the people who go into policy making professions. It's typically, from my understanding, it's typically legal education and then political science.
Right.
So
and economics sometimes.
Yeah, and economics too. Yes. And so what I was really curious about was, how can we look at how our laws are created and how they're implemented in terms of uncovering what some of the challenges are that we face in terms of actually living up to who we potentially can be as an equitable, inclusive, multicultural nation.
Got it. So how are you finding the legal, let's call them the points, the laws that were broken, or the legal precedents that were set that were not challenged in these attacks, in the wake of these attacks? How are you finding out, like, how are you doing your legal research to figure out how to frame each film, and which legal issues to highlight per film? How are you figuring that out?
So typically I'll interview several historic experts who have expert knowledge of the specific event. And amongst them, usually one of them has a substantial amount of knowledge on the laws of that time and has studied history or studied the history of law in this country. Not necessarily as like a formal area of study, but has spent time investigating that. And what we found is that in most of these cases, there was, a somewhat half-hearted attempt to prosecute, but there also was not a sense of urgency in preventing these incidents from starting and getting out of hand once they started.
Got it.
You have a situation in Tulsa where this white mob that is calling for Dick Rowland to be released to them so they can most likely lynch him, how members of that mob are deputized by local law enforcement to put down this perceived Black insurrection once armed Black men come down to the courthouse in an attempt to prevent Dick Rowland from
Got it, to protect the prisoner, the accused. I think now would be a good time. Let me try to play your pitch video that you developed and showed at Black Public Media's BPM Plus showcase back in March. It's about a 4-minute summary of your project. So let's play that for the audience. Oh, it'd be helpful if I would share the screen.
And I'll just say while you're doing that, Lisa, I'm focusing on 1917 through 1921. These incidents didn't start during this time period, nor did they end during this time period. But I think this is a really significant time period to focus on because you're coming out of World War One. We're at a point in time where there's economic uncertainty, but we're about to head into the roaring 20s. And with all the other things going on in the country and the world, this was significant enough for substantial amounts of white people and white mobs to focus on, given all the other things happening in the world.
Got it.
And also, we have the Spanish flu.
The Spanish flu. Wow. What year did that start?
The Spanish flu, I want to say that was 1917, I think.
Okay.
Maybe 1916.
What can you see on screen, Ebony and Bayeté? Are you seeing?
I see the Vimeo page, but it's not
Okay.
full.
Fantastic. I'm going to attempt to play it. Let's hope that the audio plays as well.
My name is Bayeté Ross Smith. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and education worker who works at the intersection of multimedia, photography, journalism, and installation. My latest project, Red Summers, Domestic Terrorism, 1917 to 1921, examines the history of racial domestic terrorism in the United States of America, dating back into the early 20th century. A little over 100 years ago, the United States experienced a profound period of racial and social unrest. The country, and perhaps even the world, still feels the ripple effects of this unrest to this very day. This project will consist of 5 360 VR immersive short films. These films will examine the locations of race-based domestic terrorism and tell the stories of what took place on these sites. These locations will be East St. Louis, Illinois, and Houston, Texas in 1917, Chicago, Illinois, Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, and Washington, D.C. in 1919, and Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. We will then weave in, through animation and motion graphics, archival images from these events that give the audience members the experience of looking back in time from a present-day site. These short films will be narrated through interviews with historians and local community members who have expert knowledge about these attacks. These events directly set in motion the trajectory of the civil and human rights movements of the 20th century, as well as the current social and racial justice struggles of the 21st century. In the Omaha riot of 1919, a white mob stormed the Douglas County Courthouse in an attempt to lynch a black man who was falsely accused of raping a white woman. They burned the building, causing $750,000 in damage in 1919 dollars. They also burned a police car, attacked people on the street, and attempted to hang the mayor of Omaha when he showed up to calm down the crowd. However, we can see the roots of this racialized violence extending to our current day as we look at images from the U.S. Capitol in 2021. In addition to the short films, we will also create a digital and printed study guide to further contextualize these attacks in connection to America's contemporary social justice challenges. One of the primary points of emphasis in Red Summers will be the lack of legal accountability after these events of domestic terrorism took place. Additionally, we will debunk the myth that when progress is made for Black Americans or other people of color in the United States, that progress impacts primarily those communities. In fact, that progress is something that makes the country better for everyone and positively affects life for all U.S. citizens. This series of short films will be published to the digital platform of a major media publisher. We're currently in talks with The Guardian to publish this series on their platform. Additionally, we'll create a series of public screenings and public events to showcase this work. These public exhibitions and programs will emphasize engagement with the legal community, such as district attorneys' offices, law schools, and law firms. Our current budget covers production of the 360 virtual reality films and the planning and design of the public exhibitions and programs. Currently, our budget is $250,000. This consists of $40,000 in pre-production, $91,000 in production expenses, $65,000 in post-production expenses, and $54,000 for planning and distribution and implementation of the public programs. Red Summers is currently supported by the I-Beam Center for the Future of Journalism, Black Public Media, Crux XR, and the Sundance Institute's New Frontier program. To find out more information about Red Summers, you can visit our website at redsummersvr.com. You can also email us at info@redsummersvr.com.
Lovely. It's nice to see that again. I hadn't watched it in a couple of weeks, so it was good to get the refresher. Let me see if there are any comments. So if anybody has any question, definitely post them to the chat, either on YouTube Live or Facebook Live, and we will get those on the show as soon as possible. So Bayete, why did you decide to do this project in 360 VR? I know that you are a trained filmmaker, so you could have done it in regular 2D film, but why 360 VR?
Yeah, I started experimenting with extended reality several years ago, and I gravitated to 360 VR because, given my background in photography and filmmaking, that was the most direct entry point, because you're not crafting a digital space, you're filming in a way that's immersive. And for this series, I felt like, we live on top of an unresolved history that a lot of us don't know about. And because we don't know about this history and properly investigate it, we continue to make the same mistakes that leads to these same problematic and destructive elements of history to continue to happen.
Right.
So that was why I thought, okay, immersively making people feel like they're on this site and then looking into the past from that site, I was hoping that would resonate with them and they would feel this connection to the past and see how it directly is relevant to their present day.
What is can you describe the post-production process of each film? Mm-hmm. I remember, didn't you have to hire a motion illustrator or a motion animator?
Yeah, so there's a substantial amount of post-production on these projects. What we have to do is we're taking archival images and we have to augment the images to make them look three-dimensional, because we're putting them into a three-dimensional space. And then we have to place them in the frame so it feels as if they are integrated into the current scene. And then, of course, to make it aesthetically compelling, we have to add other movement elements and visual elements to give it more pop and make it more engaging. Because ultimately, aesthetics do grab our eyes and hold our attention. And so these are things that I know how to do personally to some extent, but it's a prime example of why you always have to figure out what you can do yourself really well and when you need to call in for additional assistance.
Got it. So how long generally does the post piece of each of these films take to do?
Well, given the fact that I'm still a relatively small budget, I know with some of the budget numbers to certain people, they'd be like, oh, that doesn't seem like that seems like a decent amount of money, but it's not really that much to produce something of this magnitude. So I say all that to say it takes a little longer. It takes, a couple weeks from having the entire script set up to then, and having all the shots to then going into the post-production. But at that point, I have to have all the archival materials and all the shots. Now, if I had a bigger budget and I had a staff of several different, 3D animators and illustrators, it might take a few days because you have enough people working on it. So it's one of those things that's directly related to the scale of an institution, if you will.
Got it. Well, of the production. So what is the edit? What software are you using for the edit?
Oh, yeah, it's pretty straightforward, actually. It's Adobe Premiere and After Effects.
Okay.
And Photoshop too, because we
All
have to.
three at the same time.
Yeah.
And don't you also have a photo researcher on your crew? And what is that person's role?
Oh yes, I'm glad you asked that. So this is another really important element, but this is kind of a pre-production element.
Okay.
But I have a photo researchers because we have to find photos from each of these events. So that can be tricky sometimes because you start to really get a lot of photos of daily life right around 1920. So the further back you go from 1920, there's fewer and fewer photographs.
I see.
So we have to find photographs from these events. But then what's also most significant is we have to find the specific location, and then we have to research the angle from which they were shot from that location.
Got it.
So that enables me to film at that location from the right angle, and then figure out how to layer the photograph in so it looks as if you're seeing what happened 100 years ago.
So basically, you need that information before you go do the location shoot. You have to know exactly where you're going in each particular city to replicate archival photos that your researcher would have found before you got there.
Yes. And so, for example, what that means is I not only have to know specifically where a photo was taken, but I have to know, was it taken from the southeast corner of the block? Was it taken from the northeast corner of the block?
Right.
And then in some cases, it's even significant to replicate the time of day, although that's not a super
essential. Okay. That's just like icing on top. There's that great shot in your pitch video of the white people standing. They look wealthy, like they are in these expensive looking coats, and they're standing inside of a building looking out at us, and it appears like we're on the lawn, but you're basically showing that they're inside the ruins of a building that was damaged during one of these attacks, and looking like they're tourists, going to Disney World, basically, which is so bizarre.
That brings up an interesting point, because a lot of times when people think about incidents like this, and you think about racialized domestic terror, and you think about it as a Black people's issue, or a person of color in America issue, but it's an American issue. And there's a lot of white people who were caught up in these events to negative results as well. So that particular shot you're referencing was the office of it's either the Red Cross or the Women's League in Omaha, Nebraska. I forget which one. And it got destroyed. So that's why, the white people after the riot who weren't participating are standing there like, they destroyed, our space.
Right.
And it also in Omaha, they attempted to hang the mayor, who was a white guy at the time. Like, they actually got a rope around his neck.
So what is when is the debut of your documentary series on The Guardian US? What date?
The date is we actually moved it up one day. So it's May 31st.
Oh, okay. I'm glad we've been putting in the Chiron the entire show, June 1st, but okay, we have a correction.
Well, we just shifted that. Originally, it was going to be June 1st, but they have some things set for marketing and promotion that make it happen, that make it much more efficient for them to market it effectively on May 31st.
No worries. So I just wanted anybody who's going to watch this between now and then to know the date. And so how many episodes are you releasing this summer with them?
There's going to be 5 episodes that cover 7 locations.
Okay. And how often are the episodes releasing?
Every 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, got it. Are you completely done with all 5 films?
No, I have a lot of work to do.
Are any of them, do you need to go shoot anything for any of them, or is all the shooting done and you just need to hand stuff off to post?
3 of them are in post. 2 of them still have some shooting to do.
Okay, so where do you have to go shoot to complete those doc shorts?
Well, I have to go back to Chicago, because when I originally went to Chicago, it was, the part of what happens with these kinds of projects is your money for your budgets usually trickles in until you get like a major, like, kind of windfall of money. And so when I was originally shooting, I didn't have the money in hand to go film in Chicago until November. And because it's Chicago, it snowed.
Yeah, so
So
it's
I have to
November
reshoot in
shoot, Tulsa
Chicago
shoot.
because
Yeah.
it's supposed to happen in the summer, and then I have to go to St. Louis, and I have to go to Washington D.C.
Okay. The St. Louis
East
attack,
St.
was
Louis.
that in St. Louis or East St. Louis?
Yeah, I was in East St. Louis, so I
Okay.
need to correct myself. I
Okay.
will be flying into St. Louis, but I will be filming in East St. Louis,
Got it. Got it.
across the river in Illinois, technically.
Got it. Okay. Well, this has been fantastic, Bayete. It's been so good to get additional details about the project. I wish you nothing but the best this summer. It sounds like you're going to have a very busy June and July and August in terms of getting all 5 films through post, going and doing the additional location shooting in 2 or 3 locations. But I think it's the right time for this project. You know what I mean? And so congratulations on your approaching the home stretch. And so we at Black Boat Media and Denton will continue to promote the project and try to, help as many people as possible find out about it. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate your ongoing support of my work.
No problem. My pleasure. Well, thank you, everybody. That's the end of episode 3. Next week on episode 4, we will have Leonardo Souza, a director based in Rio de Janeiro, who is working on an animated narrative project called Rabiola Tales. See you next week.